City gasps in disbelief. A young millionaire notices his maid. Hiding bruises, and what he does next shatters the city's idea of justice. One message, one hidden camera, and a storm of flashing lights expose a hero cop no one dared question. But as the cuffs lock in the rain, the city learns mercy can be more dangerous than revenge. The cup barely touched the saucer when Ivory's sleeve slid back a finger's width. A blue crescent surfaced on her wrist, then vanished as she yanked the fabric down and murmured, "Sorry, sir." Herman Henderson didn't do sorry. He did numbers, leverage, timing. At 6:47 a.m., in a penthouse where the city looked like a table he could rearrange, he stood in a slate blue suit and watched the smallest things. How people breathed between words. How hands forgot to lie. The room smelled of fresh espresso and stone cleaner. The marble caught the first light. Ivory gripped her broom as if it could make her invisible. "Ivory," he said, not loud, just sure. She stopped by the edge of the rug, eyes on the floor. "What happened to your wrist?" "I'm clumsy." A thin smile, already apologizing for existing. "Both of them?" he asked, because he'd already noticed how she kept her sleeves low on each hand. Her fingers tightened around the broom handle. "It's nothing." Herman had rules, left over from the years before the headlines, when getting cheated once meant you slept on cold floors twice. One of those rules was simple. No one gets hurt under your roof. Not by you, not by anyone. He looked at Ivory the way he looked at a deal he intended to win. Quietly, completely. "Sit," he said, indicating the armchair. "I should finish the rooms," she whispered. He didn't move to stop her. "If something's wrong, I can fix it." Her chin trembled, but the yes never came. "It's fine." She slipped away toward the hallway, sleeve already tugged back into place. Herman watched the doorway she disappeared through and checked the time again. 6:47. He sent a single text to Nadia, his security chief. "Quiet look into Ivory James. Start with whoever thinks clumsy leaves fingerprints." From the living room speakers, the news anchor was praising a decorated police sergeant for service above reproach. Herman wasn't listening to the words. He was listening to the way Ivory had flinched when the elevator chimed. That, in his experience, was the sound of a problem someone else decided to ignore. He turned to the wall of glass in the city beyond it, already slotting names, favors, and quiet doors to knock on. The law could be slow. Strategy didn't have to be. What began with a blue crescent on a wrist was about to pull a whole web into the light, and the man holding the web would wish she'd never poured a cup of coffee in this apartment. And this is how Herman Henderson, more accustomed to rebuilding skylines than lives, decided that Ivory James would not face her fear alone. What he set in motion next would rattle precinct walls, embarrass old allies, and force the city to answer a question it had avoided for years. Before the first call went out, Herman needed one thing: a name. The Bruises had a maker, and in his world, every maker left a paper trail. That's where the story truly starts. On the morning he asked Nadia to follow the thread that led straight to Sergeant Cole Matthews. Before the elevator doors closed on the morning rush, Nadia's reply hit Herman's screen. Name found: Cole Matthews, NYPD Task Force. A second bubble followed. Links, citations, photographs where a square-jawed officer shook hands with men who loved cameras more than questions. Medals, parade sashes, a complaint record so clean it looked bleached. Before we continue today's beautiful story, take a moment to subscribe, like, and hit the bell. It's the best way to support us and never miss another moment of romance. Let's continue. Herman slid the phone into his jacket and stepped into the car. The driver eased them into midtown traffic where buses snorted and the city shaved minutes off patients one horn at a time. Outside, billboards for Henderson Towers rose in glassy procession. Champagne renderings promising light, air, a better kind of life. They looked like trophies lined on a shelf. Herman watched them pass without pride, thumb hovering over a voicemail transcript from Nadia's packet. He pressed play. Cole's voice filled the cabin, polished, practiced, the kind of sound that sold donors on community safety while asking them to ignore the price. "Anyone who wears this badge serves above reproach. New York deserves nothing less." Herman tasted metal. In the reflection of the window, he caught his own face go still, Above reproach was a phrase men used when they needed the room to stop thinking. He opened the dossier. The first page was resume theater. After that, it grew teeth. Overtime differentials spiking on days without logged operations. Cash purchase of a second vehicle registered to a cousin. An off-books condo in Long Island City. Rent paid in envelopes. Nadia's notes were scalpel clean. Construction escorts common. Rumors of protection for certain sites. Names redacted in public records, but visible in contractor group chats. Herman recognized two firm names, men who'd once tried to squeeze him on a waterfront bid. He remembered how they smiled when permits got delayed. He had moved through that by being meticulous, not loud. "Under my roof, no one gets hurt," he said almost to the glass. He texted facilities. "Activate panic protocol on Ivory James's badge. No alert tone. Silent ping to security if used anywhere on property or within 3 blocks." The reply came back with a check mark and a question. Reason? He wrote, "Safety." That was all the file needed. Traffic hiccuped near the river. A school group pressed faces to their bus windows, pointing at a crane lifting a steel beam into sky. Herman leaned his head back and thought about the years when he slept on floors and learned which promises were scaffolding and which were paint. He had rules from that time, and they had kept him from turning hard in the wrong directions. The car nosed into the underground garage of one of his towers. In the service corridor, the building's heartbeat sounded in ducts and generators. He stepped out just as a staff door swung inward and Ivory emerged with a tray of folded linens. Her hair was pinned too tight. Her eyes were pinned tighter. Her phone vibrated. She flinched and ducked into the shadow of a side corridor, pressing it to her ear. Herman didn't intend to listen. The walls, however, were generous. "Yes, I finished," she said softly. "I'm sorry. No. I said I'm sorry." A pause. "I'll do better." He took a step back into the main hall to give the moment privacy she was never afforded. She hung up. When she spotted him, her apology was already loaded. "Excuse me, Mr. Henderson." He nodded. "Everything you need for the 12th floor?" "Yes, sir." The sleeve had crept up again, and she tugged it down with a practiced flick. The tray wobbled. He caught a towel before it fell. "You're not clumsy," he said, returning it to the stack. She swallowed. "I'll try harder." He wanted to say trying wasn't the problem. The problem was a man who made her use sorry like a password. But counsel had taught him, don't push a door that isn't ready to open. Build a better key. Back in the car, he opened payroll and public service databases on 2 screens. Patterns were math once you stripped the story from them. He cross-checked Cole's posted salary against transaction reports Nadia had scraped from online seller accounts and parking camera tolls. A pattern rose like a bruise under skin, more expense than income, but no balance due. Someone was paying in cash. The driver took park to avoid a jam up ahead. Herman stared past joggers and strollers, already calculating how to pull a thread without letting it snap. Send Elena Ruiz a data packet? Too early. She'd published what she could prove, and right now the story was still fog. Internal affairs? He'd tried their tip line last year on an unrelated labor fraud and watched the report vanish like rain on a stove. He called Nadia. "How confident?" "On Cole, very. On the unit?" "Confident adjacent," she said. "They do escorts on high-theft corridors for certain construction sites. Some of those sites pay for the escort twice. Once officially, once to keep the wrong eyes away." "Which sites?" "2 belong to firms that hate you." Paper rustled. "One you beat on a midtown bid. The other's uncle sits on a zoning subcommittee. Likes to pretend he doesn't." He let a silence name the shape of it. "Ivory's badge panic is live." "Good," Nadia said. "You want a driver shadowing her commute?" He looked at the city map on his phone, the line her subway took through neighborhoods where help didn't wear uniforms. Quietly, he said, "No tails within eyesight." "Copy." By late morning, he had a list of names, a sequence of dates, and one hard fact. Cole's spotless file was the one that made the most noise. Clean as loud when it shouldn't be. Herman walked a job site at noon, helmet clipped under his arm, the foreman rattling off progress markers. Trucks backed up with beeps that sounded like metronomes. Herman's attention drifted to the far gate where 2 patrol cars idled. The officers didn't get out. They didn't need to. The message in their posture was the message he'd seen for years. We're watching. Which, depending on who you were, could mean protection or pressure. Back upstairs, a new notification crawled across his screen. Nadia again. You'll want to see this. A still image populated pixel by pixel. The raw frame from a body camera or a dash cam, the angle low and cold. A hand clamped around a woman's wrist, pale fingers digging, the tendons in the cop's forearm tight as cable. The face was blurred by motion, but the posture was unmistakable. Ownership, the kind that bruised. The timestamp in the corner read last week. Nadia's text followed. Source says the footage never made it into the official archive. Another bubble. That arm is Cole's. By the time the sun had turned the city's glass towers into mirrors, Herman already had someone in motion. Santos, his quiet, unshakable private investigator, was the kind of man who could find shadows in daylight. Herman met him in the back of the penthouse study, blinds drawn, the air thick with coffee and quiet urgency. Map his circle, Herman said, sliding the file across the table. The precinct, his uncle's office, anyone who calls him a friend. Santos nodded once, scanning Cole's photograph. How close do you want me to get? Close enough to hear who he drinks with, Herman replied. But far enough that he never hears your name. By nightfall, Santos's quiet trail began to take shape, a precinct, drinking hole where Cole's badge carried more fear than pride, an uncle who held office in the city's infrastructure bureau, and two foremen who had once tried to bribe Herman out of a midtown development contract. They'd all toasted with Cole once, and Herman knew what that meant. Proximity wasn't coincidence. It was policy. While Santos traced the outer web, Herman built the inner one. Every quiet thread was spun for Ivory's safety. Locks replaced on her queen's apartment, a hallway camera discreetly mounted under the exit light, and a driver instructed to follow her subway route at dawn and dusk. Each precaution was written off as building maintenance or employee support upgrades. Nothing that could be traced back to him. Ivory noticed some of it, of course. The new deadbolt, the flickering hallway light that suddenly worked again. Lucky week, she had murmured, keys in hand. When Herman offered to have a car take her home one evening, she declined without looking up. I don't want to be trouble, sir. He didn't insist. He simply made sure trouble would find her less easily. But luck, no matter how carefully staged, always runs thin. One night, Ivory unlocked her apartment and paused in the doorway. Something was wrong. The air itself was disturbed, the kind of silence that follows someone leaving. She walked slowly to her dresser, noticing the faint scrape of wood on tile. A drawer slightly open. The top scarf, the one she folded every morning, was turned the wrong way. Her pulse climbed. She moved through each room with her breath held tight, whispering to herself that maybe she'd left it like that. Maybe memory was tricking her. But the feeling didn't leave. Whoever it was hadn't stolen anything. They just wanted her to know they'd been there. She sat on the edge of her bed until the room began to blur. Her hands shook. Her first thought wasn't of anger. It was guilt. She shouldn't have stayed. She shouldn't have made it this far without leaving. The next morning she came to work earlier than usual, pale but composed, moving with the careful silence of someone who doesn't trust her own noise. Herman saw it immediately. Miss James, he said when she entered the foyer, take a moment. You look tired. I'm fine, she said automatically. Her voice wasn't convincing either of them. Later that day, he approached her with an offer disguised as routine. I need your help with something, he said. We're staging one of the model apartments for a client tour this weekend. You've got an eye for what looks lived in. Come choose the linens. She hesitated, puzzled. Me? You, he confirmed. 10 minutes. In the model apartment, the noise of the city seemed to dissolve. Everything was polished, untouched, waiting to be filled with someone's life. Ivory stood by the tall windows, sunlight skimming her face, hands clasped to stop the trembling. I need your opinion, Herman said softly, laying out fabric samples. White or cream? Cream, she murmured. White stains too easy. He nodded, pretending to compare them. You said something yesterday, that you didn't want to be trouble. She stiffened. I didn't mean... I know, he said. But if someone is hurting you, that's not trouble. That's crime. Her eyes dropped to the carpet. The silence stretched between them, heavy and breathing. I'm fine, she said again, but the words broke halfway through. Her hands twisted in the hem of her sleeve. You don't have to worry about me. I already do, he said quietly. That's the problem. She looked up then, eyes wet and defiant. You don't understand, Mr. Henderson. People like him, he doesn't just stop. If he finds out someone's asking questions, he'll... She stopped herself, pressing her lips together, as if saying his name might summon him. Herman studied her for a long moment, then reached for one of the folded linens and set it gently on the counter. Then we'll make sure he doesn't find out, he said. Ivory stepped back, shaking her head. Please, just let it go. He didn't answer. Some truths didn't need an argument. When she left, Herman stood alone in the perfect, silent room. Expensive furniture, spotless surfaces, no life at all. Through the glass, he could see the skyline shimmering against a pale winter sun. From this high up, the city looked orderly, structured, safe. But he knew better. It wasn't safety, it was illusion. Invisible walls, built by power, reinforced by silence. And somewhere behind one of them, a man named Cole Matthews was still smiling for cameras, certain that no one would ever pull his picture off the wall. Herman reached for his phone and typed one word to Santos. Closer. The river under the FDR pulsed with low-tide silence. In the half-light beneath the overpass, the city's heartbeat was distant. Sirens, tires, wind against stone. Santos waited in the shadows until the young officer finally appeared, shoulders hunched in a jacket that didn't fit and nerves that barely held. You're late, Santos said quietly. The officer, barely 30, badge once gleaming, now pawned for a gambling debt, kept his hands deep in his pockets. You said you'd help me square things with Marco. You said you had information, Santos replied. A moment of negotiation passed in the air, measured by cigarette smoke and fear. Then the officer pulled out a small, battered phone. Task force skims on construction sites, he said, voice thin. They call it escort security, but it's protection money. You pay if you want your trucks to move. He hesitated before adding, there's one message you'll want to see. He scrolled to a thread and handed it over. On the cracked screen glowed a text. CM, keep the trucks moving. Henderson's people don't get priority. Santos stared at the initials. Cole Matthews. The officer nodded. He's got friends high up. Don't say my name. You don't have one, Santos said, pocketing the phone. You were never here. By sunrise, the device was on Herman's desk. He read the message twice, jaw tightening. The initials were confirmation. Cole wasn't just an abuser. He was a broker in a system that thrived on coercion. Herman flipped through the attached files, payments from construction firms he knew too well. He recognized the names immediately. One belonged to the man who'd once offered to adjust permits on a Henderson project for a six-figure facilitation fee. Another had spread rumors about non-union labor just to tank his bid. This wasn't just Ivory's nightmare. It was an ecosystem. He leaned back in his chair, letting the city hum below the glass. Then he called Nadia. Pull financial pressure points on these two companies, he said. Freeze them legally, not loudly. How loud do you want the press? She asked. Whispers only. Send breadcrumbs to Ruiz. Elena Ruiz, investigative reporter for the Ledger, was a patient shark. Herman trusted her sense of timing. She didn't detonate stories, she let them seep. He drafted an anonymous drop, invoices, escort receipts, and the single text that named his company as an obstruction. Enough to raise questions, not accusations. When he hung up, the air in the office felt heavier, like the moment before thunder. He rubbed his temple and glanced at the clock. Ivory's shift had started 30 minutes ago. She appeared at noon, quiet as ever, holding a tray of documents. The first thing he noticed wasn't her silence. It was the red mark blooming at the corner of her lip. What happened? He asked. She blinked, caught. Oh, cabinet door, she said softly, forcing a laugh. I wasn't looking where... Mrs. Chun stepped forward from the hallway, eyes sharp with fury. That was no cabinet. Ivory flinched, the sound of the older woman's voice cutting too close. Herman raised a hand. Calm, controlled. Ivory, he said, take the rest of the day. Mrs. Chun will handle your list. I can work, she murmured. I didn't ask, he said, tone flat. The conversation ended there. When she left, Mrs. Chun stayed behind. Sir, she needs protection. She has it, Herman said. She just doesn't know yet. That afternoon, he met the deputy mayor at a charity luncheon downtown, tables dressed in gold linen, cameras clicking like insects. The deputy smiled too easily, a man of appetites and favors. Herman Henderson, he greeted, raising a glass. Always building something new. Trying to keep the foundations clean, Herman replied. Speaking of which, I've noticed some irregularities in escort allocations for city construction sites. Task force involvement, audit variances. The deputy's smile didn't move to his eyes. I'm sure it's nothing. Good men out there keeping the city safe. Good men don't hide receipts, Herman said. The deputy laughed. A little too quick, a little too loud. You always did see ghosts in the walls, Henderson. Herman leaned forward. Ghosts don't skim cash or bruise women. The man's face tightened. He set down his drink and reached for the safe ground of conversation. We'll have someone look into it. Herman watched him leave, the words still hanging like smoke. The message was clear. Back down or they'll pretend you don't exist. That night, Santos called from the street below Ivory's building. Package delivered. Camera live. Good, Herman said. Stay close for 72 hours. She won't like it. She doesn't have to. At 10:13 p.m., Ivory climbed the steps to her apartment. The new lock turned smoothly, the air cool and still. She dropped her keys in the bowl and froze. Something new sat on the small table near the window. A bouquet of red lilies wrapped in plastic. Her first thought was confusion. Her second was dread. She approached slowly. The flowers were fresh. Tucked between them was a folded note in block letters. Tell them nothing. Her phone buzzed at that moment. A new message. Cole. Dinner. Don't be late. Her hands trembled as she deleted the text, the screen blurring behind a wash of tears. The flowers rustled when she brushed past, their scent too sweet, too sharp. She sank into the stairwell outside her door, head against the cold rail, sobbing quietly where no one could hear her. Up the street, Santos saw the light in her apartment flicker off. He raised his phone and sent one message to Herman. It's begun. The boardroom smelled of cedar polish and quiet ambition. Screens glowed with numbers that could rebuild half a city, profit margins, bid projections, waterfront schematics worth $1 billion in whispers. Herman listened, contributed, approved. His mind precise as a blade, but half of him wasn't there. While his partners debated zoning codes, he was thinking about a different structure entirely. The kind that kept people like worry trapped behind fear bomb instead of concrete. When the meeting ended, he rose, crisp and unhurried, shaking hands with men who thought empire was measured only in square footage. They didn't notice the way he turned to the window before leaving, eyes fixed on the skyline, as if the answer to something much larger was hidden between its lights. In daylight, Herman Henderson was every inch the shark they admired. At night, he was something else, an architect building safety out of strategy. By noon, he was back in his office, sleeves rolled, eyes hard. Nadia stood by the glass desk, jaw set. You are stretching too thin, she said. You've got a board expecting miracles and a cop circling your maid like prey. We can end this faster if we stop playing polite. Herman glanced up. Define faster. Take him off the board, permanently. Her tone was even, clinical. You have contacts who owe favors. There are quiet ways to do it. No guns, Herman said, the words cutting through the air like glass. Then what? You think paperwork scares men like Cole? Paperwork, no. Proof, yes. He turned his laptop around. The task force roster, payroll anomalies, unfiled overtime claims. We dismantle him with the truth. That's the one thing men like him never prepare for. Nadia's silence was approval hidden under frustration. Then we'll need Ruiz. She's our smokescreen. She'll have it before the weekends, Herman said. The door opened without a knock. Ivory stood there, pale and trembling, fury held together by fear. "You need to stop," she said, voice shaking but loud enough to make Nadia turn. "Ivory, I heard your men talking," she interrupted. "They said you've been watching my building, recording people." Her voice cracked. "Please don't. You don't understand. When people try to help, he makes me pay for it." Herman rose, slow and deliberate. "Sit down." "No," she snapped, backing away. "You think you can fix this like one of your business deals? But he's not like you. He doesn't lose. He ruins. He'll take everything, your company, your name, just to prove he can." He crossed the room until the space between them was a breath. "Then this time," he said quietly, "he'll pay." Ivory blinked, disbelieving. Promises to her were decorations over graves. "You don't mean that." "I do." Her hands shook as she gathered her courage and shattered it in one sentence. "Then I quit." Nadia started to speak, but Herman's hand silenced her. "If that's what you want," he said, his tone was steady, almost gentle, "you'll still be paid through the month." Ivory looked at him, waiting for him to argue, to insist, to control, but he didn't. That scared her more than anger. "You think letting me walk away makes you noble," she whispered. "It just makes me your next ghost." She turned and left before he could reply. When the door closed, Nadia exhaled through her teeth. "You're just going to let her go?" "She's not ready to believe safety exists," he said, "but she'll have it anyway." That night, he doubled the watch around her building, 2 plain cars rotating every 4 hours, one ex-Marine driver tracing her subway route. He gave no new orders, no new questions. He didn't have to. Across the city, a different kind of movement began. Elena Ruiz, whose inbox was an orphanage for anonymous tips, opened an unmarked email. Inside were data packets, overtime logs, contractor transfers, and a web of payments feeding into a Shell LLC registered under the Matthews Trust. It led back to Cole's uncle, buried in bureaucratic code. Ruiz leaned back in her chair, a half-smile cutting through her exhaustion. "So the hero's got a family business," she murmured. She started making calls, city auditors, old sources in procurement, one XDA who still owed her a favor. Most didn't answer. One picked up, only to say, "Leave it alone, Elena. Cops like him don't fall. They pull others down with them." She ended the call, stared at the files again, and started writing. Meanwhile, Nadia worked the surveillance feed from the task force locker room. Static, chatter, laughter, the usual noise of men who thought the walls were deaf. Then came the sharp slam of metal against metal, followed by a burst of laughter too cruel to be casual. "Guess she's learning," a voice said. Another chuckled. "Yeah, Matthews knows how to train a girl to behave." Nadia froze. The recording clicked once more. A final line, half drowned in echo. "Ivory." She stared at the screen until the file ended, then hit forward and sent it straight to Herman with no subject line. Just one word in the message body. "Listen." The first article dropped at dawn, buried halfway down the Ledger's homepage. Anomalies in task force procurement. No names, no accusations, just the math. Elena Ruiz had learned long ago that truth didn't need volume, just persistence. The piece outlined mismatched invoices, overlapping contracts, and escort hours billed twice under infrastructure assistance. One graph, 3 paragraphs, and a single question at the end. If the system is clean, why does it keep erasing its own fingerprints? By noon, the story had detonated online. Comment sections burned like wildfire, half calling her brave, half calling her reckless. A few recognized patterns, naming precincts. One mentioned Sergeant Cole Matthews by name, only to have the comment vanish minutes later. Inside City Hall, contractors who'd once toasted with Cole's uncle started whispering words like audit and liability. Several quietly paused their payments, citing internal reviews. Money stopped moving. And when money stops, tempers start. Cole's uncle raged through his office, red-faced, breaking a pen against his desk. "Find out who fed her that data," he barked into the phone. His assistant, pale and sweating, nodded and wrote nothing. The web was tightening, but in the background of every tightening thread was a woman trying to disappear. Ivory James no longer wore her maid's uniform. She now wore an apron and a name tag that read, Grace. The diner on 48th and Lexington was open 24 hours, its neon sign half dead, its regulars half awake. She worked the night shift, the quiet hours when the city's noise softened enough to hear your own thoughts. Around midnight, a boy wandered in. 15, maybe 16, too thin for his jacket. He sat at the counter counting coins with the weariness of someone who'd already stopped expecting kindness. Ivory poured him coffee before he asked. "It's on me," she said. He blinked, unsure. "You sure?" "Yeah," she smiled faintly. No one should shiver alone. She watched him sip slowly, warming his hands on the cup. Something in his eyes reminded her of her younger brother, the one she couldn't save years ago when the system looked away. That memory hurt less now, maybe because she'd found someone who finally didn't. At 2:00 a.m., the bell above the door chimed again. A man in a slate blue coat stepped in. Familiar posture, unfamiliar setting. Herman Henderson looked completely out of place among the chipped tiles and flickering lights. Ivory froze mid-pour. "You shouldn't be here." "I was nearby," he said simply, sliding into a booth. She crossed her arms. "You own half this city. You're never just nearby." He didn't argue. Instead, he left a folded napkin on the counter with a note scrawled in his clean handwriting. "Freedom is not a favor. It's overdue." When he left, the napkin hid a small stack of bills beneath it. 1 month's rent exactly. She found it 10 minutes later, stared at it, and whispered, "Why won't you just stop?" The next morning, she climbed the marble steps of his penthouse, every nerve trembling. Mrs. Chun tried to stop her at the door, but Ivory pushed past. Herman was standing by the window when she spoke. "I won't be bought," she said, placing the folded bills on his desk. "Not by him. Not by you." Herman looked up, studying her face like he was memorizing the moment. "Good," he said. "Then consider it a deposit in something that belongs to you." "I don't want anything that belongs to you." "You already have it," he said quietly. "Your name's on the Haven Fund." She frowned. "What fund?" He turned back to the window. "For women who need to start over. I thought you'd approve." There was no reply, only the soft sound of the elevator doors closing behind her. That afternoon, Nadia called. "We found a new link." "Talk," Herman said. "Dash cam vendor. Half their units are missing. They filed a retention exception on footage from last month's task force routes. Guess whose unit was on rotation?" Herman didn't need the answer. "Matthews." "Exactly. There's something on those drives," Nadia said. "Something they're willing to bury behind paperwork." "Then dig," Herman replied. Nadia chuckled dryly. "You don't pay me enough for this kind of shoveling." "You're paid in satisfaction," he said. "Then you owe me overtime." That night, the city hummed under cold rain. Herman read and reread Elena's article, each line like a quiet blade cutting through corruption's polite language. Outside, traffic shimmered in streaks of red and gold. He closed his laptop and whispered to himself, "It's beginning." Across town, the diner closed early for cleaning. Ivory slipped out the back door, coat collar up, bag slung over her shoulder. The streets were slick, reflecting neon puddles. Her shift tips barely filled a pocket. She turned onto her block, footsteps echoing softly. Halfway down the street, she felt it. A hum behind her, an engine idling too long. She turned. Nothing. The headlights blinked once, then went dark. She quickened her pace, keys clenched in her hand. At her building, the security light flickered. Her heart thudded against her ribs as she climbed the stairs 2 at a time. When she reached her door, the lock turned too easily. The air inside was colder than it should have been. She flicked on the light. The chair near her window was slightly moved. The curtain swayed through the window was shut. She set her bag down, breathing unevenly, eyes scanning the small apartment that no longer felt like hers. A faint smell of aftershave hung in the air, the kind she used to smell on Cole's collar. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. No message. Just silence on the other end. Ivory backed into the hallway, her breath catching, the door creaking open behind her. For a long moment she stood there, trembling in the dark, listening to the city whisper her name. Rain crawled down the cracked window like veins on glass. Ivory stepped into her apartment and stopped breathing. The room had been turned inside out. Drawers dumped, closet half empty. Her clothes lay in heaps like discarded skin. The bouquet from days ago, red lilies once alive with their threat, was now brittle straw, still sitting on the counter. Her gaze dropped to the table. The cheap wood, once smooth, now bore carved letters, deep, jagged, deliberate, mine. She sank to her knees, heart thrumming, eyes locked on the single word. No broken locks, no forced entry, just ownership carved into her life. Her legs gave out, and she sat on the floor, shaking, whispering, "Please stop, please." Down the block, Santos's car idled. When she didn't appear after 10 minutes, he called Herman. "She's not answering." Herman's voice was low and steady. "Go in." 10 minutes later, Ivory was standing in the rain, coat half buttoned, trembling as Mrs. Chun wrapped a blanket over her shoulders. Herman waited beside the car, expression unreadable. "I'm not leaving," she said, voice breaking. "He'll think I'm running." "He already does," Herman replied. "But you're not running, you're disappearing." "I can't hide forever." "You won't need to." She shook her head. "You don't understand what he's like. He doesn't stop." Before Herman could answer, Mrs. Chun stepped forward, eyes fierce. "Daughter," she said softly, "let someone hold you up for once." The word daughter undid her. Ivory's chin trembled, and she nodded once. An hour later, she was in a hotel under a different name. Marion Dorsey, in a corner suite Herman had secured under an out-of-state shell company. 2 security details were assigned discreetly to the floor. Santos handled logistics. Nadia handled digital shadows. Herman sat by the window listening to rain pound the glass while the city below blinked in half-light. "Anything from internal affairs?" he asked. "Not yet," Nadia said. "But I've got something better." She dropped a flash drive on the desk. Body cam footage, never filed. Herman inserted it. The screen came alive with static, then rain and headlights. The angle shifted as a uniformed officer, Cole, dragged a woman from a car and pressed her against the hood. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "Cooperate, and you drive home. Complain, and you don't." The woman sobbed. At the edge of the frame, another officer stood watching, then turned away. The timestamp the same week as the still Nadia had found earlier. Herman's hand tightened on the desk. "Get me everything from that night. The precinct logs, traffic reports, GPS pings." "Already on it," Nadia said. "But we can't sit on this long. If we push too hard, they'll bury it." "Then we don't push," Herman replied. "We leak." He called his media director. "Package it in stages. Timeline first, then the money flow, then the footage. One piece every 48 hours. Drip it so fast they can't kill the story before the next wave hits." Elena Ruiz received the files that night. She opened them in her apartment, the glow of her screen reflecting in her eyes. Task force hours, payments, footage. Every breadcrumb was a map leading straight into the heart of corruption. She drafted the first headline carefully. "Shadow hours. Inside the police contracts, the city forgot." The story went live before dawn. By midday, whispers turned into storms. IA Lieutenant Farrow read the article twice, leaned back in his chair, and muttered, "About damn time." Then he signed the internal memo authorizing a quiet preliminary probe. He didn't copy his superior. Some doors, he knew, opened best in silence. At noon, Herman's phone rang. The number was familiar, the city infrastructure office. "Mr. Henderson," came a voice slick with false politeness. "This little media circus you've started is making my nephew's job complicated. Maybe we should discuss your permits. I'd hate for them to go missing." Herman smiled into the receiver. "Then I hope you made copies." A pause. "Excuse me?" "Because I did." He ended the call before the man could answer. Outside, thunder cracked. The rain turned fierce, rattling the windows like fingers tapping for attention. Herman stood by the glass, watching water streak down the skyline. Somewhere out there, a man named Cole Matthews was realizing his empire had begun to crumble. Hours later, a black car sliced through that same rain. Cole sat behind the wheel, eyes bloodshot, knuckles white. His suspension had been official for 2 days, but rage outranked orders. Every radio station spoke his name now. Unnamed officer under investigation. Every whisper at the precinct turned heads when he walked in. He drove without headlights, without destination, until the street sign in front of him read the same name he'd seen on her old lease. His pulse quickened. He parked outside the hotel 2 blocks away, the one he'd followed her to once months ago. He didn't know the lobby cameras were upgraded last week, or that the hallway lights were replaced with brighter, wider angle fixtures. He didn't know Herman had personally written the check for that installation. Cole stepped inside, dripping rain, cap low, gun heavy beneath his jacket. The elevator doors opened with a chime, camera blinking red above. He didn't look up. The feed streamed live to Herman's office. Got him, Nadia said, eyes on the monitor. In the flickering hallway, Cole Matthews stalked forward, unaware he was walking straight into light. The rain came down like a verdict, thin, cold, and endless. It slicked the pavement outside Ivory's old apartment, pooling in the cracks where the city forgot to care. A black car idled across the street, engine humming low. Inside, Cole Matthews watched the empty windows with the patience of obsession. He'd been sitting there for hours, hand resting on the grip of the gun he'd been ordered to surrender 2 weeks ago. He told himself he only wanted to talk, to make her understand how she'd ruined him, to remind her that everything she was, every breath she took, had once belonged to him. A shadow moved in the alley. Cole straightened, heart kicking. But it wasn't Ivory. It was Santos, wearing a cap and holding an umbrella, pretending to smoke. He didn't look at Cole's car. He didn't have to. He just whispered into his collar mic, "He's moving." Cole started the engine. The taillights blinked red against the rain. The decoy car, a black sedan driven by one of Herman's security men, pulled from the curb 3 blocks down. It matched the route Nadia had predicted he would take. The same turns, the same shortcuts he once used to follow Ivory home. Cole took the bait. The rain intensified, blurring headlights into long white scars. He followed the sedan through narrow side streets, unaware that every turn had been calculated. Each block funneled him closer to the building across from the hotel's service entrance, an abandoned delivery warehouse. The alley behind it glistened with puddles and trash bags. Above, 3 floodlights were hidden beneath plastic sheets, and 6 small cameras blinked unseen from metal beams. In a van half a block away, Herman watched the monitors. The feed glowed against the dark, one view from the alley, another from the roof, and one tight shot of the car's license plate. Nadia sat beside him, headset on, calm, but ready. "He's following the path perfectly," she said. "He's predictable," Herman replied. "They always are. They return to where they had control because it's the only place they still feel powerful." Cole parked by the service door. He stepped out, rain hitting his shoulders like needles. The city had hollowed him out. Suspension notices, frozen accounts, his uncle's calls ignored by every official he'd once bought. The news cycle had turned. The whispers were no longer admiration. They were disgust. He couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand her. He pulled his jacket tighter, his hand brushing the weapon tucked beneath. His eyes flicked upward toward the windows of the hotel across the street. Maybe she was up there now, hiding, waiting for him to crawl back. He smiled bitterly. "You think you're safe," he muttered. "You think anyone can protect you from me?" He stepped forward. "Now," Herman said quietly. The floodlights detonated. White brilliance tore the alley open, blinding, merciless. Cole froze mid-step, his arm half raised. From the darkness behind the dumpsters, figures emerged. Internal affairs officers, raincoats gleaming under the sudden light. Their guns stayed holstered. Their badges didn't. "Sergeant Cole Matthews," one shouted. "Step back and keep your hands visible." Cole squinted, stumbling. "You don't understand. I'm here to—" "Hands up now." He reached for the gun instead. The motion was instinct, not reason. But the moment his hand brushed the weapon, red lights blinked to life, every camera in the alley capturing the angle. The officers moved as one, surrounding him, water splashing under their boots. "Get down!" Cole's mind fractured under the noise. Commands, rain, the taste of panic. He turned once, saw the nearest lens flashing red. "You think you can film me?" he shouted. "You think this makes you better than me?" Herman watched from the van, expression carved in stone. "Don't look away," he told Nadia. He's been protected by silence long enough. Cole stumbled backward, slipping on wet concrete. His knees hit first, then his palms. The gun clattered away, skidding into a puddle. Two officers closed in, pressing him face down as the cuffs clicked, shut. His voice cracked when he yelled, "Ivory!" The sound twisting in the rain, half a cry, half a curse. For the first time, the city saw him small. The cameras caught everything. The soaked uniform, the desperate struggle, the man who'd once walked into rooms as if laws were for lesser people. Nadia exhaled slowly. "It's done." Herman didn't answer. He just stared at the screen, rain streaking down the van's windows like mirrored tears. "No," he said. "Now it begins." Across the city, phones lit up one after another. The Ledger posted the footage within minutes. News alerts bloomed like fireworks. Sergeant Cole Matthews, arrested in abuse and corruption probe. Leaked footage confirms pattern. Cable anchors repeated the headline in looping astonishment. One called it the reckoning of a department. Another called it the fall of a hero. By midnight, the story was everywhere. The footage played on every screen, from diner televisions to subway ads. The city that had once praised him now watched him kneel in the rain. Inside the hotel, Ivory sat on the edge of her bed, the news flickering blue light across her face. Mrs. Chun sat beside her, holding her hand tight. They watched in silence as the broadcast replayed the arrest from 3 different angles. The voiceover narrated each frame like a confession. Cole's face was swollen, furious, wet. The cuffs gleamed under the floodlights. The reporter said, "Sources confirm the arrest follows a months-long investigation into systemic corruption involving members of the NYPD task force. The primary suspect, Sergeant Cole Matthews, is being held without bail pending federal review." Ivory's hand went to her mouth. A soft sound escaped her, half gasp, half disbelief. "Is it really over?" she whispered. Mrs. Chun's fingers squeezed hers. "Look." On the screen, the banner changed. "No bail, federal partners interested." Ivory's tears came quietly, shoulders shaking as she exhaled years of fear she didn't know she'd been holding. "He's gone," she whispered. From the hallway, Santos's voice came through the door, muffled but sure. "No," he said softly. "He's finished." Herman stood in the adjoining room watching the same broadcast. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply lowered the volume and turned to the rain-streaked window. The city lights blurred in reflection, a mosaic of gold and silver and storm. Somewhere beneath that glow, a man who thought he owned everything was learning what it meant to lose. Nadia entered quietly, handing him her phone. "Public reaction's wild. They're calling you the ghost behind the curtain." "I'm not the story," he said. "She is. She doesn't know that yet. She will." Outside, the rain softened. The last headline scrolled across the screen. "City demands reform after Matthews' arrest. Victims encouraged to come forward." For the first time in years, Herman let himself exhale. The floodlights in the footage still burned in his mind, not as vengeance, but as proof. Justice could be loud, but truth shone quietly, even through the rain. Dawn found the penthouse soft and quiet, the city softened to watercolor through the glass. The marble floors no longer felt like a stage for fear. The air had weight again, but a kinder weight, the kind that sits after a storm when the windows are open and the house remembers how to breathe. Ivory stood by the window and saw herself not as a silhouette made to disappear into the shine, but as a person held cleanly in the light. For a long time she had lived in reflections, other people's versions, other people's names, other people's rules. The woman in the glass had her own outline now. Herman watched her from the edge of the room, a figure in shirt sleeves, tie loose, an expression that had nothing to do with acquisitions or margins. His phone was face down on the desk. The city could wait on its own alarms. He cleared his throat once, not to command attention, just to keep his voice from catching. "There's something I want to offer," he said. Ivory turned, careful as if the quiet might break. "Please don't say help." "It isn't." He reached for a slim folder, the sort of folder that usually contained blueprints and closing schedules. Inside were bylaws, a provisional charter, a budget with careful columns and clear lines. Haven Foundation, he said. It's fully funded for 3 years. Offices are on the 19th floor of the 47th Street building. If you want it, you run it. She didn't touch the folder. Run it how? Your way, he said. Not charity, authority, board seats, one for you as executive director, 2 survivor advocates you choose, 1 trauma clinician of your choosing, 1 seat for a community liaison. Programs, your call. Counseling, relocation stipends, legal support, job pipelines, whatever you judge essential. I'll fund it and keep my name off the door. She studied him, wary of words that felt too good to be true. And what do you get? Sleep, he said. Sometimes. That's not how this usually goes. I'm not interested in usually. He slid the folder closer. There's also a clause for independence. Haven outlives me, outlives my company. If I vanish, the fund remains. If I ever try to meddle, you can vote me out. Ivory held him in the kind of silence people use to test if a room can bear the truth. I don't want to be anyone's symbol, she said. You won't be, he replied. You'll be someone's door. She looked back at the window, the city rising, a choreography of scaffolds and steam and morning light. Beneath it, newscaster voices would be reciting last night's timeline for the 50th time. She'd watch the footage once more, just to prove to her fear that evidence existed outside her body. She didn't need it now. The tremor that had lived in her hands like an unwanted tenant was gone. Trauma-informed advisors, she said at last, non-negotiable. In the budget already, Herman said. I have a list of candidates, but you won't need it if you have your own. I do. She paused, then added, and a hotline staffed by people who speak with care, not curiosity. Done, Bessie. She finally took the folder, opened to the first page. The numbers were precise and generous, the kind that made possibility feel less like a speech and more like a calendar. For a moment, she let herself imagine rooms that began with soft lamps and ended with signed leases. Safes with spare phone plans, a closet with coats for winter that didn't smell like someone else's anger. If I say yes, she asked, will you disappear back into your high floors and let me do this? I'll walk downstairs when you call, he said. Otherwise, I'll keep the lights paid. Ivory closed the folder. Yes. The word landed lightly but rang in both of them. Herman nodded once, the smallest smile breaking the discipline of his face. We'll start today. The day did not wait for them. By mid-morning, the Ledger published Elena Ruiz's follow-up. Survivors' accounts distilled gently, names present only where consent allowed, faces blurred, details shaped to protect rather than to thrill. The piece moved like water through a drought, quiet, patient, unstoppable. She wrote not about scandal, but about patterns, how a city trains its ears to stop hearing, how files lose themselves in filing cabinets, how women learn to speak around danger with a fluency that should humble anyone who claims to know what strength looks like. Phones at City Hall lit up again, but there were fewer slammed receivers this time. The deputy mayor, who had laughed too quickly at lunch weeks before, stepped to a podium with humility forced into his posture. He announced a task force to reform escort protocols and procurement audits, new recording requirements, external review panels that could not be chaired by people who wore the same uniforms as those they reviewed. It was not redemption. It was paperwork on the way to something better. Sometimes change begins with the bland. In a small chamber, hidden from cameras, Lieutenant Farrow of Internal Affairs sat before a committee and spoke with the restrained anger of someone who had watched good officers drown inside bad systems. He testified about obstruction, misfiled footage, and a locker room culture that turned jokes into orders. We do not fix this with one arrest, Hebrews said, voice steady. We fix it with doors that cannot be quietly locked from the inside. Herman declined every interview request that reached his office, and there were many. Some asked outright if he was the architect. Some pretended to ask about the waterfront bid before angling toward the scandal. A few tried to flatter. He instructed his assistant to send one standard response. No comment, the story belongs to survivors. He did not let a camera claim him. He would not be the face remembered while people who had spoken at great risk were reduced to footnotes. The city loves a singular hero. He had learned that hero worship is just another way to avoid collective work. Still, myth grows in any light. A podcast called him a ghost, and the name stuck in certain corners of the internet. Forums traded theories. A security guard who once held an elevator for him claimed he had heard Herman mutter plans into the air vents. He hadn't. The shadows were happy to write their own chapters. Herman ignored them. The work ahead made noise enough. On 47th Street, a dusty floor became Haven's first office by afternoon. Nadia stood with a cluster of volunteers hauling in secondhand desks. A painter rolled warm white across the walls, while someone else assembled bookshelves with the determined clatter of an Allen key. A stack of welcome kits grew in the corner. Prepaid phones, transit cards, a form letter that read, "You are believed here." Elena arrived with boxes of donated laptops and a hug that surprised Ivory, who returned it, awkward and grateful. Santos hung the first frame print, a photograph of open water taken at dusk. The horizon, a thin, bright line. "Soft edges," Ivory said, running a hand over a chair with rounded arms. "No sharp corners where fear can catch." "On it," Nadia replied, already texting a furniture vendor. A woman in a denim jacket came in slowly, hat tugged low, friend at her side. She spoke to the intake volunteer with halting patience and the kind of dignity that grows best in rooms where no one is taking notes for a headline. As she sat, Ivory felt the old ache in her chest and didn't flinch from it. She went to the supply closet and returned with a mug of tea that smelled like calm. "It's yours," she said, "not borrowed." By late afternoon, a corkboard on the wall held printed cards with names of clinics willing to see patients tonight. A short list of landlords who had agreed, under watchful eyes and legally binding agreements, to hold apartments for emergency placement, and 3 attorneys' numbers who would not ask cruel questions. The foundation was not yet elegant. It was effective. Elegance would wait. That evening, Elena's third piece went live, braided with official statements from the deputy mayor and quotations from Lieutenant Farrow. A sidebar explained how to document safely, how to speak to a reporter without losing control of one's story, how to file a complaint with a real person attached to the process. Below the article were links to Haven and other organizations that had been doing this work long before the city pretended to notice. Comments came, some ugly, some beautifully ordinary. "This happened to my sister. Reading this with my daughter. How can I help?" The ugliness did not win. It rarely does when truth has time to stand still and be looked at. Herman visited Haven just as the last sunlight left the street. He walked through the doorway and did not try to take up space with purpose. He watched Ivory talk with the denim jacket woman, not as a savior checking on his project, but as a man seeing an answer to a question he'd asked himself for years and never found a business school word for. When Ivory finished, she came over with a faint, tired smile that held more life than any triumph he'd ever seen on a stage. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like breathing without counting," she said. "Like room." She nodded to the wall. "I'm naming the conference room Mitut Chun. She won't like it, but she'll get over it. She'll cry and tell everyone she had dust in her eye," Herman said. And for once, he didn't pretend he hadn't imagined this. He left before the night grew heavy, riding the elevator down alone. The lobby security guard nodded toward a pair of reporters waiting on the sidewalk. "Want me to tell them you went out the back?" "Tell them nothing," Herman said. "Tell them you saw no one, and then take your break." Back in the penthouse, the city folded itself into night. The rooms welcomed him with lamps set low and the quiet that had once felt like accusation. On the kitchen counter sat a sealed envelope dressed in Mrs. Chun's careful handwriting. Inside was a note on Haven letterhead. "Ivory's first official correspondence as executive director. Thank you for funding the lights. We'll do the rest." Below it, a small receipt for 2 coffees, more a joke than an invoice. He took the hint. The next morning dawned clean. When Ivory arrived, the sky had the hopeful blue of a bandage peeled away to reveal skin beneath that will heal if left alone. She moved easily now, sleeves rolled above unmarked wrists. The kettle hissed. 2 cups waited. Herman entered with a stack of unread messages he still had no intention of answering. She poured, steady, no tremor. "Cream?" she asked. "Just a little." They carried the cups to his office window, where the city sprawled in its brilliant, battered ambition. They said nothing for a while, practicing a quiet that didn't need to prove anything. Their toast was small, the clink almost nothing. They drank to rooms where no one flinches, to decisions that take their full consequences and keep walking, to the unglamorous daily labor of keeping promises. Below them, the streets began their glittering choreography, buses nosing into lanes, a cyclist beating the light, a child on a scooter dragging a parent toward the day. News vans had found other stories. The city continued as it always does, not redeemed, not ruined, simply responsible for itself in a way it hadn't been yesterday. Herman set his cup down and let his gaze travel the familiar skyline. Once he had measured it only in square footage, lots to acquire, air rights to negotiate, views to sell. Now the lines meant other things too, routes to a shelter, windows that could hide or reveal, roofs that could hold gardens where exhausted people might sit and remember their names. He spoke without ceremony, as if telling a fact about load-bearing beams. Some buy buildings, he said, not for credit but for truth. Others rebuild lives. If this were a film, the camera would drift from the two cups on the sill to the city's shoulder as it shrugged on another morning. The light would lift over scaffolds and steam, over the Haven office where a phone would ring and be answered with kindness, over the precinct where a memo on the bulletin board, dull and bureaucratic, would nonetheless begin to change how certain doors close. It would float past the river to the delivery warehouse whose alley still remembered the white glare of floodlights, then back again to a high window where a man once obsessed with edges allowed himself to soften. The frame would hold there, long enough to make room for breath. Then the city, taught a lesson it won't forget, would move.